Ok, merci beaucoup. Donc c'est.
Thank you very much. So it's a no, double negative here. So I am in favor of abandoning colloids. And I'd like to thank the Scientific Commission for inviting me here for this discussion that actually relates to our mistakes. And I think it's not a problem if we make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. But what's important is really to draw some lessons from our mistakes. So here are the labs with which we work, and none of them manufactures colloids, as far as I know. And the first 2 points I wanted to discuss here and to underline is that we're never sure about anything. We still have many doubts, many questions relating to all of these issues. But at this stage, and for quite a while actually, the reasonable way for us as doctors in the ICU to behave would be to really focus on patient safety. And as of today, it's clear there's no doubt in that regard. The second point is the fact that it's possible to make do without colloids. I say that because very often when we start mentioning the side effects, the risks, people say, but how can we do if we can't use colloids? Well, actually, it's very possible. When you look at the data, for example, on the Cohen-Renard group, they gradually abandoned colloids. First, they used hydroxyethyl starch and gelatin and crystalloids. And when they looked at data on the lactate normalization, the decrease in vasopressors, the normalization of the map with between 200 and 250 patients in each arm with the same criteria of severe sepsis or septic shock, it was impossible to find a difference. There's exactly the same evolution. So you have exactly the same effect if you use crystalloids instead of colloids in terms of the patient's evolution. And if you want actually some figures, high figures, for example, if you compare the basic crystalloid, salted serum, the basic one, all the way to the most sophisticated colloid product, which is the albumin, the natural colloid, that might also have some other effects beyond the simple filling effect. And you take some patients with filling in the ICU, you see absolutely no difference in terms of mortality. So this is the first point. It's really possible. It's actually possible to stop using colloids. Nobody will criticize you for doing so. There's quite a lot of data showing that it's possible. So I said we needed to draw the consequences of our mistakes. Actually, I was brought up with the use of colloids, and when I was young, working in the ICU, I was thinking only about colloids, because if the intravascular pressure goes up, then I'll try to maintain the fluids within the vessel by increasing the oncotic pressure, so I'll have fewer capillary leakages and fewer pulmonary edema. So there was a rationale there, and I thought for a very long time that it was impossible after a severe septic shock to use anything but colloids. There were not only mistakes, there were some lies also, so it made things more complicated. I'm not going to dwell on this, but you know that part of the discussion was made more complicated because of a number of false studies. So we're going to forget about this at this stage, but there are still some facts that are rather bothering. So it started at the Necker Hospital in Paris. The kidney specialists looked at the kidney biopsies, and they realized there was an epidemic of nephroosmotic lesions. So they used to see that from time to time And now it's really rare to see those biopsies without these injuries. And the kidney function of the patients is not as good. And when they try to understand what has changed, well, in the ICU, they realized that they have started using this new fantastic product for filling, because it has been very well presented, that is hydroxyethyl starch. So they told the specialists it could be a problem, and they answered, well, should have a controlled study on a very limited number of cases. The resuscitation of organ donors, either with hydroxyethyl starch or with gelatin. And with a very low number of patients that had been transplanted, they realized that it confirmed the observations, clinical observations that had been made by the kidney specialists, that is, many more patients will need hemodialysis and a kidney function that is less good. So a first strong signal about a possible kidney toxicity for these products. In the Necker Hospital, young Frederick Shortgen, young kidney specialist who then worked in the ICU, and we were discussing that, and actually it was well known. Less than 10 years before, we had described about the same thing with dextrans, and we had learned our lesson. We said we need to stop using dextran. This is not a reasonable molecule. So when Frederick arrived in Créteil, well, she said, well, our patients with an ischemia and sepsis, it might be the same thing. We should really look into the possible toxic effect of hydroxyethyl starch. And to prove that really I was brought up with colloids, we never thought about comparing it with thalloids. Don't worry, I'm not getting upset. So we said we're going to compare this with gelatins. At one point, they had been accused of being a source of mad cow disease or whatever. But anyway, we conducted a study. It was difficult, let me tell you, because people said you're conducting a study to show the negative effect of a product. No, we're conducting a study to show that a product we use on a daily basis is not so good. And indeed, we showed that it led to an impairment of kidney functions. So what are those starches coming from corn or potatoes? And when we looked at literature, it was amazing, unbelievable. All of the people who were using this had found some deposits in the kidneys, in the liver, in the spleen, in the skin. And there were some pruritus that were described month after using some of these products, and it had some effect on coagulation also. So really a long list of accumulated toxicities that was really frightening. So we were told it's because it's not the right molecules. We're going to change the substitution degree, the molecular weight, the carbonated radicals on which these are based on HES, but we changed it. We studied different products, and as our German friends say, in French, actually here, the more it changes, the more it's the same, and I'll show you that at the end. So there's a second possible mechanism that could explain this kidney toxicity. If we go back to dextran, for example, is the fact that to pressure, well, it's a mechanism well known to stop the glomerular function. So with some patients with ischemia, if the oncotic pressure increases too quickly, here you see some measures of the oncotic colloid pressure. You see a direct relationship with the urine output, so it might also have this toxic effect. And this was a question we had with Frederick when we looked at an observational multi-centered study. That was a very wide study. We looked at the filling process for patients. We saw in the survey that the choice of the filling product depended on local customs and not on the patients, actually. And we tried to look into the impact on the kidney functions of various levels of oncotic products from crystalloids all the way to hyperoncotic albumin. And taking into account the limitations of these studies and the very sophisticated adjustments, we always found that the more we used hyperoncotic products, the more we had some toxic elements in the kidney with kidney dysfunction. And for the hyperoncotic albumin, there were more cases of dialysis or renal replacement therapy indication, and we found the same effect in terms of mortality also. When we looked at the other questions, we were told it will protect from ARDS, but we realized that the only important factor was really the quantity in terms of volume. But what was interesting is that the quantity of volume that led to ARDS was much less high for colloids than for crystalloids. So to protect from ARDS, it might be better to use crystalloid, actually. So basically, all of our certainties were vanishing. We were using toxic products, and at the same time, the meta-analysis of Cochrane, when you have a meta-analysis on Cochrane, you need to reassess them every 2 years. Well, every 2 years, they wrote exactly the same thing, saying we have no evidence that these products change anything about the prognosis for patients. We have much evidence that it's toxic. We do not understand why these products are still being used beyond trial. So that was the first part of the story. And for a number of us, well, it made us look back on starches and maybe on colloids in general. And the second part, well, these are the major clinical trials that were conducted with the very first study on volume insulin in severe sepsis, the VISEP studying the insulin and also starches, which shows clearly that there is a toxic effect for kidneys, with a strong trend towards an increase of mortality in patients that are being treated with HES. There is also the dosage effect that seems obvious. More effects, toxic effects also on coagulation, more perfusions. So this is a study that seems to corroborate everything that had been said before. On that basis, actually, Conrad Reynolds' team, the VISEP study team, decided to stop using HES. They went to gelatins. It didn't change really much, so they moved on to crystalloids, and there they found a clear reduction of AKI in the units. So here we have a hard time really trying to sell these products, and that's when really we got the last blow, which was a study coming from a country where starches didn't use, where doctors said, well, as they didn't use, well, now they are being introduced. Before launching them on the market, we're going to test it, and we're going to conduct a study on septic shock. So 800 patients with septic shock, HES acetate versus Ringer acetate, so exactly the same crystalloid that contains the starches as the one that is going to be used in the other arm, and results that are really frightening. That is, there is 1.5 to 2 times more RRTs, and also a clear, significant increase in mortality. So these are the detailed data that were published a few weeks later in the New England Journal. On the methodological level, this is really a remarkable study. It was conducted in a blind mode. Products were delivered in identical bags, and this study showed that the quantity of the volume administered in both arms was exactly the same, contrary to the way we used to think we're going to use 4 times more crystalloids than colloids. No, it was the same quantity. wide study with a stratified randomization that limited the maximum doses so that it couldn't be criticized in the same way as VZEP, where they used doses above what was being proposed by the manufacturer. So really remarkable study. And a study that showed that every 13 patients, you kill a patient with this product. So once you've reached that point, really you have to react. You cannot simply say, okay, I'm not sure, I think my patients are doing better. No, it's really terrible. So then the other major study was the Australian study with the same principle. That is, a product was brand new in the country. They decided to test it in the Australian way. So the condition of the patients was not as severe. No difference in terms of survival, but in terms of side effects with more use of RRT. And it's more complicated for kidneys because the effect seems less important on creatinine. But in terms of RRT, it's really very significant, and it has an impact on kidneys. So meta-analysis conducted not with all HES, but with the last generation, and we're told they are the least toxic. Well, it shows that there's an impact on the kidney, probably also on mortality when you compare it to a crystalloid. That there doesn't seem to be a difference with other colloids, so maybe other colloids are dangerous also, as Conrad Rennert suggested. And also, there's no significant difference with the other starches. And these other meta-analysis suggests, with this analysis a little bit like the triangular test that was used by Tulali in his study, that we have reached a point where we're sure that these products are toxic for patients. You need to wrap up. Okay. Well, it's disappointing to see that the firm doesn't really react, and here is the data we have. And this will be my last point in just a few minutes. No? Gilali had a good idea. He had a great idea. But he got this idea a long time ago. It was in 2000, more or less. And he said, well, we have this notion of toxicity. We do not know exactly what's happening. And many people continue using it, so we should have a pragmatic study. You still have time afterwards, you know, okay, to respond. Okay, I'll keep one slide. So Gilali, I think it was a very good idea. He launched this pragmatic study. The problem is that it took close to 10 years to conduct this study. Well, maybe 9 years and a half, okay. So it's not much of an exaggeration. And the tidal volumes have changed, as well as the corticoids, doses, insulin, everything. So it's not possible to conduct a study over 10 years. It's not possible to have a study on crystalloid and colloids where 50% of the crystalloid patients have received already 1 liter of colloids before being randomized. So I know it's complicated. I'm not criticizing this study, but I'm not sure if this data is strong enough to put into question the terrible results coming from the previous studies. We have some curves that are very similar. At day 28, in terms of survival, we have some results that are extremely difficult to understand, and it's very honest from them to show us this. Why at day 28 there was this epidemics of death in the crystalloid group. I think it's also related to a problem in the collection of data, and I think we